Summary and Analysis Chapter 15 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. Huck and Jim judge that they are 3 days out of Cairo, near the Ohio River. The pair plans to take a steamboat up the Ohio into the Free States, where slavery is illegal and Jim can no longer be hunted. But a fog sets in, limiting Huck and Jim's visibility. With Huck in the canoe and Jim in the raft, the two become separated and Huck becomes lost. Huck hears whooping sounds, and thinking them Jim's signal, he whoops back, but to no avail. Huck continues to drift, lonesome, and, at some point, takes a nap. When he wakes, Huck realizes how big the river is before spotting the raft in the distance. Huck and Jim reunite. Huck asks Jim if he fell asleep and why Jim didn't think to wake him. Jim says he is just grateful that Huck didn't drown. Huck asks Jim if he's been drinking, to which Jim, taken aback, responds that he hasn't. Huck tells Jim that he must have been dreaming that the pair was separated, indeed, that there was any fog at all. Jim can't believe it. He sits quietly for 5 minutes. At last he tells Huck he must have been dreaming, but that it was the most powerful, vivid dream he'd ever had. Huck requests that Jim tell him all about his dream, which Jim proceeds to do. Jim even interprets the dream, saying that the whoops are warnings of bad luck, the towheads are troubles the pair is going to get into with mean people unless the two mind their own business, and that the river clear of fog is the Free States. Huck then asks what the leaves and rubbish on the raft mean, along with its broken oar. Jim realizes that Huck was tricking him all along. Jim hadn't been dreaming at all. He and Huck really were separated, and there really was fog. Jim tells Huck that he was heartbroken thinking that Huck had died in the fog, and that he had cried and wanted to kiss Huck's foot to see him safe and sound again. And Huck could only think about making a fool out of Jim with a lie and shaming him. When he hears all this, Huck is himself ashamed. At last, after working himself up to humble himself to a black person, Huck apologizes to Jim and feels no regret.
Analysis. The Free States are Jim's beacon of hope as a place the laws of which preserve his freedom. They are also a symbol in the novel for freedom generally. However, at a crucial juncture, it is not slave hunters, for example, who impede Huck and Jim progress to freedom, but rather nature, specifically the fog that separates Huck from Jim. Even though nature is not persecutory like society is, it is random, indifferent to human desires, and sometimes, as here, dangerous. Huck has tricked Jim before, but not about something so important as this. That he is inclined to trick Jim at all demonstrates Huck's childishness, but it also demonstrates, more problematically, Huck's callousness toward Jim, maybe the product of his belief that Jim is racially inferior to him. Huck doesn't yet fully empathize with Jim. Even though the fog occurred randomly and without malice, Huck's lie, that Jim dreamed the fog, encourages Jim to think of it within a superstitious interpretive framework, not as random and meaningless, but as meaningful. Jim is angry at Huck not for lying, but for failing to imagine the consequences of his lies, and, more generally, for failing to imagine how he, Jim, experiences the world. Jim was worried to death for Huck, even like a family member would worry, but Huck can't imagine that and sees only a cheap opportunity to trick Jim in the style of Tom Sawyer. But after Jim expresses how much he worried over Huck, Huck realizes how calloused he's been, and, as he will later in the novel to an even greater extent, he treats Jim like the equal that he is. That Huck feels no regret for apologizing shows his willingness to cross the slave/white divide, and to see Jim as a true human being.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 16 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. Huck and Jim continue their journey to Cairo, and, as they approach it, Jim trembles, and is feverish with the thought of being so close to his freedom. Huck begins to tremble and feel feverish too, because he acknowledges that he is helping Jim to liberate himself. Huck's conscience is troubled by this. It tells Huck that he should have told someone that Jim was running away, that he is meanly wronging Miss Watson, who has done nothing to harm him, by helping Jim, her property. Huck feels so mean and miserable that he wishes he were dead. Restless and fidgety like Huck, Jim talks about what he will do when he is free, how he will work and save money so that he can buy his wife and 2 children out of slavery, or, if the owners of his wife and children won't sell, how he would enlist the help of abolitionists to steal them. Huck is mortified to hear Jim speak this way, about stealing his children, who belong, Huck thinks, to a man that hadn't ever done me no harm. Huck is sorry to hear Jim lower himself in this way. He resolves to turn Jim in. Jim spots in the distance what he thinks is Cairo. Huck volunteers to paddle over and see if it is, with the intent of turning Jim in. As he does, a skiff comes along, aboard which are 2 armed men. They tell Huck that they're hunting 5 runaway slaves, and ask Huck if there are any people aboard his raft, and if so, whether they're white or black. Huck desperately wants to tell them about Jim, but the words won't come out of his mouth. At last, Huck lies. He says the man aboard his raft is white. The men say they'll see for themselves. Huck tells them he wishes they would, because, he lies, the white man on the raft is his father, who's sick, along with his mother and Mary Ann, also aboard the raft. As the men paddle to investigate, Huck lets on that the illness that afflicts his family is both contagious and dangerous, smallpox. As soon as Huck does so, the men refuse to get anywhere near the raft, apologize to Huck, give him money, and paddle away. Huck feels bad and low when he returns to the raft, but reasons that he would feel just as bad had he done right and turned Jim in. He figures it is easier to do wrong than right, and that the outcome of doing either is the same, and so decides to always do whichever come handiest at the time. Jim finds Huck hiding in the river, holding on to the raft. Jim praises Huck for his clever deception of the 2 men. Huck and Jim resume their journey, passing 2 towns, only to find out that neither are Cairo. Huck tells Jim that the 2 of them must have passed by Cairo when lost in the fog nights earlier. Jim doesn't want to talk about it and blames the rattlesnake skin for their bad luck, a judgment with which Huck agrees. Huck and Jim learn they have reached the muddy Missouri River and figure that Cairo is upstream. They decide to canoe there after resting. But when they return to where they left the raft and canoe, they find that the canoe is missing. They are forced to raft downriver till they reach a place where they can buy a canoe. As they drift, a steamboat comes at them full speed. Huck supposes that the captain is playing a kind of game of getting as close to the raft as he can without touching it. But the steamboat keeps coming. A bell rings and men yell and cuss at Huck and Jim to get out of the way. At last, the steamboat crashes into the raft, throwing the pair overboard. Huck swims ashore and finds himself before a house, and then barking dogs swarm him. Huck knows better than to move.
Analysis. Huck has no control over his conscience, conditioned by society. It makes itself known to him not with a reasoned argument, but a bodily symptom of sickness, and, as such, Huck can't reason with himself to figure out what course of action he should take. Instead, at least for now, he can only do what conscience compels him to do. In relation to conscience, then, Huck is not free, though he will grow into such a freedom. Jim's course of action is very reasonable. He wants to liberate his family from unjust bondage, but Huck, in the throes of his southern slave-owning conscience, can't understand the logic of Jim wanting to free his family no matter which way, and does not see it as ridiculous that Jim's family should belong more to their master than to Jim, or themselves. The slave owner may never have harmed Huck, but he has harmed his slaves simply by owning them. Even though his conscience tells Huck to turn Jim in, Huck has an even stronger ethical force at work in him, one that literally prevents him from producing language to turn Jim in. If conscience is conditioned by society, this stronger ethical force in Huck is deeply personal, and, as such, it is not riddled with hypocrisies as conscience is. Huck's lie to the men, which ultimately saves Jim from discovery, is an action more expressive of Huck's personality than any other he could have made. Note that the slave hunters Huck talks to are not vicious. They do the best they can to help Huck's made-up sick family without futilely endangering themselves. It's clear that their hunt for Jim is conscience-motivated, not vice-motivated. It's just that a society that accepts slavery as okay is, by necessity, turning even good men into hypocrites. Given that Huck would feel bad regardless of what course of action he pursued, he realizes that conscience is not a firm means of determining what is right. He therefore endorses an ethic of handiness. Whatever his heart tells him to do instinctually, Huck resolves to do. He is free, in this way, to be himself, and by following his heart and his compassion, Huck's actions will show the depravity of the moral rules that dominate Southern society because of its embrace of racism. Despite how excited Jim was to reach the Free States, he gracefully accepts the bad news that he and Huck have passed Cairo. This may well be because of his superstitions. Instead of blaming somebody for bad luck, he just moves on. Huck and Jim live in a world that doesn't seem to have a bottom on bad luck. The pair seem to be in a rough spot after missing Cairo, but that doesn't even compare to the bad luck of losing their canoe, and what's worst of all, the bad luck of their random collision with the steamboat. We might wonder though, is it childish of Huck to think the steamboat captain is playing a game, or merely optimistic? Or maybe Huck has seen captains play such games before. Whatever the case, after this tense scene, Huck and Jim are once again on their own.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 17 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. A man, speaking out of a window into the darkness, commands the dogs to hush and asks, "Who's there?" Huck says that he's George Jackson, only a boy. The man asks if Huck knows the Shepherdsons. Huck says that he does not, but the man remains skeptical. Nevertheless, he invites Huck into the house, but tells him that, if anybody is with him, Huck better tell them to stay back lest they be shot. Huck slowly approaches and enters the house, greeted by a family, the Grangerfords, some of whom are armed. All of them agree, though, that Huck is not a Shepherdson. The Grangerfords are welcoming and friendly and provide Huck with a meal, clothes, and a place to stay. The boy who lends Huck clothes, Buck, is about as old as Huck is. He boasts that if there had really been Shepherdsons outside, he would have killed one. His father tells Buck that he'll get his chance to do just that, but all in good time. After changing into dry clothes and speaking with Buck, Huck goes down into the parlor to find the Grangerfords smoking and talking. He eats and talks with them. The family assures Huck that he can stay with them for as long as he likes. Huck admires the Grangerfords' home, many of the features of which, like the brass doorknob and the brick-bottomed fireplace, are more characteristic of a house in town than in the country. Huck also admires the family's collection of books, which includes classics like Pilgrim's Progress, which Huck finds interesting but tough. Hanging on the parlor walls are pictures depicting people and scenes from Revolutionary America, like George Washington and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Also hanging on the walls are pictures painted by a member of the Grangerford family, Emmeline, a little girl who died young, all of which are dark in theme and color. Her masterpiece is of a woman preparing to jump from a bridge, but Huck thinks the woman looks too spidery. Emmeline also wrote poetry about the deaths of men, women, and children, for example, a ballad for a boy who drowned in a well. Huck likes Emmeline's art, and even tries to pay tribute to her with a poem of his own, but he proves unable to write one. Emmeline's room, Huck says, is kept the same as it was on the day she died.
Analysis. As a rule, Huck, however receptive and empathetic, distrusts the people he meets on his travels, giving false names as a matter of course. But, as this scene makes clear, it's not only Huck who is distrustful. The Grangerford who invites Huck into his home is skeptical of Huck too. While it is good of the Grangerfords to overcome their distrust, it is also sad that their society is structured in such a way as to engender such distrust at all. Buck is like Huck in almost every way, even in the sound of their names, except for the fact that he is embroiled in an inherited family feud. While the Grangerfords seem good, that the youngest of them should be so bloody in his thoughts is shocking. Of course, Buck cannot be held accountable for his involvement in the feud. As Huck was harmed by his father, so too is Buck harmed by his, though in a subtler way. Huck and Pap's household is contrasted with the Grangerford household, whereas the former is characterized by laziness and meanness, the latter is civil, literate, and historically conscious. Despite all their cultivation, however, the Grangerfords are still hypocritically engaged in a barbaric feud with the Shepherdson family. If Huck is a vital realist in his speech and actions, Emmeline is a morbid romantic, whose imagination is as grandiose as Tom Sawyer's, but much darker. Could it be the case, though, that her art is about death only because it is a classical artistic subject? The literary form at which Huck is most at home is the novel, which, unlike Emmeline's poems, is stuffed to the brim with life.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 18 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. Huck regards Mr. Grangerford, who is the least frivolous of men, as being a gentleman, well-bred, dignified, a joy, but also the stern peacekeeper of the household if need be, though there is seldom the need. This is because all of the Grangerfords are respectful and good-spirited. The older sons of Mr. Grangerford are tall and beautiful in Huck's estimation. One afternoon, they toast their parents along with Huck and Buck. The Grangerford women are all beautiful too, one proud, grand, but good, another gentle as a dove. 3 Grangerford sons have died, along with Emmeline. Huck observes that many slaves serve the Grangerford family, each Grangerford being tended to by one slave. Huck himself has a slave to tend to him while staying at the Grangerford home, though, because Huck is not used to being served, he does not give his slave much work to do, while Buck, in contrast, works his slave very hard. Mr. Grangerford, Huck learns, owns many farms and over 100 slaves, and it is by profiting from his slave-worked farms that Mr. Grangerford has amassed his wealth. Huck learns that there is another aristocratic family living nearby, the Shepherdsons, as proud and grand as the Grangerfords. One day, as Huck and Buck are hunting, a Shepherdson named Harney rides by. Buck tells Huck to jump into the woods and Huck does so. Buck fires a shot at Harney, but only manages to knock his hat off. Harney rides toward where the boys are, gun in hand, but they run as fast as they can, not stopping till they reach the Grangerford home. Mr. Grangerford is pleased to hear this story recounted. However, he tells Buck that he does not want him to shoot Shepherdsons from behind a bush, but that he should jump into the middle of the road next time to shoot. Huck asks Buck why he wanted to kill Harney. Buck says he doesn't have a reason, that Harney never did anything to him, but it's on account of the feud that he would have killed him. Huck has never heard of a feud. Buck explains that it's when 2 families fight till everybody's dead, and then there's no more feud. Buck explains that many Grangerfords and Shepherdsons have died in the feud, and many have been wounded. He explains how, just this year, an old Shepherdson rode down and killed a young Grangerford, only to be killed himself a week later. Huck says the old man must be a coward, but Buck says there isn't a coward in either of the 2 feuding families. Huck goes to church with the Grangerfords and listens to a sermon about brotherly love, which he finds tiring, but which the Grangerfords discuss approvingly at length. After church, Miss Sophia, a Grangerford girl, asks Huck into her room. There she asks him to do her a favor and not tell anybody, which Huck agrees to do. Miss Sophia tells Huck to retrieve her copy of the New Testament from the church. As Huck enters the church, he notices many hogs resting on the cool floor. He observes that, while people go to church only when they have to, hogs go to church whenever they can. After retrieving Miss Sophia's testament, Huck shakes it and out falls a note, on which is written, 2:30. Huck gives the testament and note to Miss Sophia, who lights up when she reads the latter. Huck inquires as to what the note is about, but Miss Sophia, secretively, doesn't respond, and she sends Huck off to play. Huck heads down to the river, only to notice that the slave tending to him, Jack, is close behind him. Jack tells Huck that, if he comes down into the nearby swamp, he, Jack, will show him a lot of water moccasins, a kind of snake. Huck, though suspicious, agrees, and follows Jack through the swamp. Instead of leading Huck to snakes, however, Jack leads him to Jim, hidden on a densely vegetated piece of land. Jim tells Huck that their raft survived the steamboat crash, patched up by Jim himself, and is hidden. The next day, Huck notices he is alone in the Grangerfords' house. He goes outside, where Jack tells him that Miss Sophia has run away to marry Harney Shepherdson. All the Grangerfords are out and about trying to prevent the marriage. Huck runs after the Grangerfords to the river road, where he finds mounted and armed Shepherdsons shooting at Buck, and another Grangerford hidden behind a woodpile. Huck hides in a tree and watches one of the Grangerfords shoot a Shepherdson out of his saddle. The other Shepherdsons tend to the man, and eventually ride away. Huck calls to Buck, who begins to cry, saying that his father and brothers are dead, and that he wishes he had killed Harney the day he saw him on the road. The Shepherdsons ride back and shoot at Buck, and the other Grangerford boy. Wounded, the two boys jump into the river. Huck feels so sick he almost falls out of his tree. He regrets, he says, ever having seen such things, and dreams about them often. After dark, Huck climbs out of his tree and vows never to return to the Grangerford house. He feels guilty for having ignited the day's violence by not telling anybody about the note in Miss Sophia's testament, which he figures must have meant that Miss Sophia was to meet Harney at the time specified. As Huck creeps along the river bank, crying, he finds two dead bodies, one of them Buck's. Huck covers their faces, thinking how good Buck was to him. Huck goes to where Jim is hiding. Jim is so glad to see Huck that he hugs him. Huck tells Jim to lose no time in shoving the raft off into the river so that the pair can leave the violence and danger of the feud behind them. Huck is nervous until he and Jim drift 2 miles away from where the Grangerfords and Shepherdsons live, at which point he feels safe and he and Jim share a meal. Huck meditates that all homes seem cramped up and smothery except for a raft, aboard which you feel mighty free and easy and comfortable.
Analysis. Mr. Grangerford is a foil to Pap. Where Pap is debauched and murderous toward even his own son, Mr. Grangerford is dignified and beloved, even in his just sternness. He is the kind of man who, we think, should be most self-reliant and self-governed. But, just like Pap, Mr. Grangerford is swept up by societal dictates to endanger his family in their feud with the Shepherdsons. That his children are so good and beautiful just shows how much he stands to lose. Just as the Grangerford-Shepherdson feud is hypocritical, so too is it hypocritical that a person as cultivated and seemingly good as Mr. Grangerford should own slaves. Indeed, the means of his and his family's cultivation is built on slave labor. Buck may have read Bunyan, but he has learned from his father that owning and being cruel to slaves is a matter of course. This passage introduces the Shepherdson family, who are in bloody conflict with the Grangerfords. Mr. Grangerford implies that the feud is waged for the sake of honor, which is bestowed by society on its members, like how Miss Watson imposes her values on Huck. Though seeking honor is dangerous, even fatal, Mr. Grangerford encourages Buck to seek it. Honor, it would seem, is more important to the Grangerfords than life itself. Like a miniature civil war, the Grangerford-Shepherdson feud has cost many lives, and Buck himself casually supposes that it will end only when everybody involved has been killed, which only shows how pointless the bloodshed is. More than that, Buck doesn't even know what the feud is about. He has pitifully inherited his bleak bloody fate from the society he lives in. What makes the feud all the more pathetic is Buck's insistence that all involved are rather heroic. So many good people are killing one another, and all for nothing. It is ironic that the Grangerfords, who are waging a feud of brotherly hate, approve of the sermon on brotherly love. Hypocritically, what they approve is the opposite of what they practice. In this case, religion could instruct the Grangerfords in leading better, happier lives, but their commitment to Christian values is less than their commitment to senseless honor, or worse, they don't even realize that they're hypocrites. Huck's innocent observations about humans and hogs in church allow Twain to drive home this charge of religious hypocrisy. This scene foreshadows Miss Sophia's elopement with a Shepherdson boy. The note in the Testament is right at home there. Its contents give Miss Sophia information about meeting with her beloved, which is consistent with the ideal of brotherly love. Right after Miss Sophia makes to rendezvous with her partner, Jack, of his own free will, and with benevolence, unites Huck with Jim. We might think that Jack is eager to help Huck, because he has not been cruel as Buck is to his slave, and that he helps Jim because, like Jim, he also has a love for freedom. This scene also foreshadows Huck's escape from the feud on the repaired raft with Jim. Like Romeo and Juliet, Miss Sophia and Harney come from feuding families, but love one another nonetheless. Their families try to put an end to their love for no reason other than the feud, as if to protect the family name, but all their actions to that end only consume the families themselves in senseless bloodshed. Most of the male Grangerfords are wiped out. Buck becomes personally embittered towards the Shepherdsons, and it seems that he was right when he said that the feud will be over only when everybody's dead. Even though Huck hates the mindless violence he witnesses to the point that he feels sick, and the part of human nature that gives rise to such violence, he only does so because he has such a deep love for human goodness, like Buck's as expressed before his tragic, senseless death. It is difficult to keep in mind, also, that Huck is just a boy, yet he feels as though he's bearing the weight of so many deaths for not exposing Miss Sophia's elopement with Harney. Huck grows from this experience, however. In the future, instead of even considering idealist solutions to problems, he will more and more privilege practical consequences. Even though the Grangerfords were a welcoming surrogate family to Huck, their lives were so cramped up with their mindless feud that no one could feel free in their company. Indeed, it is only on the raft, on the wide open river, in the company of his surrogate father Jim, so to speak, that Huck can feel free and comfortable at all.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 19 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. One morning, while canoeing through a creek in search of berries, Huck encounters two men running, pleading with Huck to let them on his canoe, begging for their lives. Huck tells the men not to jump into the boat, but to run through the bushes, and then wade through the creek, before finally meeting up with him later, to throw the pursuing dogs off their scent. The men do so. After meeting up with the two men, Huck learns that the older one got into trouble for selling an article to take tartar off the teeth, while the other, younger, one for running a religious temperance revival against drinking alcohol while, his devotees discover, drinking himself. The two con men agree to work together. The older one specializes in cons that involve doctoring and preaching. When the younger con man learns this, he bemoans the fact that he is forced to con people, having once been so high. He claims to have been born the Duke of Bridgewater. Huck and Jim pity the man after he begins to cry, and the Duke tells the pair that they should bow when they address him, and do so by his official titles, and to wait on him, which Huck and Jim do. Later, the older con man claims, also crying, that he is the late Dauphin, or King of France. Huck and Jim begin to comfort the king as well as the Duke. The Duke becomes sour, but the king tells him that he should cheer up. Life on the raft is comfortable, with plenty of food and ease. The king asks for the Duke's hand, and the Duke gives it to him. Huck and Jim immediately feel more comfortable after the unfriendliness on the raft dissipates, for, as Huck thinks, what you want above all things, on a raft, is for everybody to be satisfied and feel right and kind towards the others. Indeed, even though Huck knows that the Duke and King are con men, he doesn't say anything, so as to avoid conflict.
Analysis. This scene recalls the earlier scene in which Huck and Jim flee from the slave hunters, who have arrived at Jackson's Island. And, indeed, Huck's shared experience with these men might be one of the motives he has for helping them to secure their freedom. The con men play society against itself for personal gain. They exploit silly trends, like oral cosmetics, as well as societal religiosity. Unlike most people Huck has met, these two men are not hypocrites, even though they are liars. Indeed, in some ways they seem similar to Huck and Jim. As Tom creates a miniature society with his gang, so too do the con men make a miniature society of the raft, with themselves as rulers and Huck and Jim as servants. Huck and Jim opt into this arrangement out of pity, and maybe genuine credulity on Jim's part. The Duke gets sour at the king because the king managed to lie himself into a higher rank than the Duke. After Huck witnesses the Grangerford-Shepherdson feud, maybe as a result of witnessing it, he becomes very wary of human conflict, actual and potential. In his ideal society, people would be kind toward one another. Even though he knows that the Duke and King are con men, he doesn't expose them, because they seem harmless, and because exposing them may only cause unnecessary conflict.